Now we're going to use a model that will help us represent unemployment, cyclical unemployment, and inflation. So the first component is the aggregate demand side of the model, which is simply a schedule showing output demanded at various price levels. Because aggregate demand represents all goods and services whose prices vary, we're going to have to use a price index to describe those price levels, and we're going to use that consumer price index again. We say that output demanded or aggregate demand at any price level is the sum of goods and services purchased by consumers. We use C, your shoes, food, ski passes. Investors, which are really firms' purchase of capital goods. So those resources, remember K for capital. So they're making investments, buying capital goods to produce goods and services with the hope to make a return on that investment. Government spending, well, the government has to maintain highways and public lands and buy office supplies and defense spending. And the net exports, these are going to be the goods that other countries buy from us, but we're going to net out what we buy from other countries, our imports. So we use NX. Sometimes I think we do X sub N for net exports as well, depending on the textbook you're using. If net exports are negative, or if net export, and I guess that's written in the singular, is negative, are Americans purchasing more goods from the rest of the world or selling more goods? We're going to obviously be importing more, so imports are greater than our exports. And so what are we doing? We are purchasing more goods, more goods from the rest of the world. So we say aggregate demand is the sum of C plus I plus G plus NX. So how do we represent this? We put our price index, let's go CPI here, or you could just write P for our price level. And we're going to represent this aggregate demand as our amount of real GDP, right? And we say it is downward sloping like all goods and services. Aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus NX. So aggregate demand represents real gross domestic product because consumer spending is, our purchase of final goods and services in the market that increases GDP, and investment spending, we're going to add that into that amount, and government spending, we're going to add that into that amount, and then, of course, the net exports. So aggregate demand can also increase, like we always talked about. So here we have an increase in aggregate demand, or aggregate demand can decrease. There's a decrease in aggregate demand. And if our price levels are changing, what do? We just get a new value for real GDP and we move along the aggregate demand curve. Well, let's talk about the things that cause aggregate demand to change, those shifts. If we have changes in any of those four components, if any of them increase, aggregate demand will shift to the right. What causes consumer spending to change? Changes in income. Think about normal goods. There's a positive relationship. If income levels are going up, then consumer spending will go up. And typically, let me just make a note right now. When we talk about national income, when you read about national income, really what you're reading about is GDP. Because GDP does represent national income. Changes in interest rate. How much we borrow at that rate. There's a negative relationship. Oops, there should be an I right here. If I increases, consumer spending is going to go down. Changes in consumer confidence or expectations about the economy. So if we have confidence that the economy is growing and doing well and jobs are being created, then we're going to see a positive relationship here in that if consumer confidence goes up, consumer spending goes up. If consumer confidence goes down, consumer spending will go down. And then changes in personal income taxes. If taxes go up, spending is going to go down because our income levels will be going down because of those tax increases. There's a term called the marginal propensity to consume, and I know you don't like seeing an acronym that we've used prior in this class, but in this context, MPC is a macro term referring to how much consumer spending changes when income changes, because we either spend our income or save it. The marginal propensity to save, MPS, is simply the proportion of the change in income that is not spent, 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Or we could say the change in savings relative to the change in income. So if our marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, so for every dollar increase in income, we spend 90 cents of that, then the marginal propensity to save would simply be 0.1. What causes investment to change? I, the cost of capital, the interest rate, what you borrow at. And again, we're going to have that inverse relationship. So if I goes up, investment goes down. And the expected rate of return on investment, or the profit rate. So I'm using R here. So if the firm has expected higher rate of return on investment than that borrowing rate, then of course you would expect investment to increase. They expect to make a positive rate of return. So let's say the interest rate to borrow funds to make a capital expenditure is 2%, but you expect to make a 8% return on that investment, a profit rate of 8%. Well, since 8% is greater than 2%, you're definitely going to make an investment in that capital expenditure. Well, when investment goes up, there's this thing called a multiplier effect. And we use the term alpha for multiplier. An increase in investment of $1 will increase GDP, obviously, by that $1, or national income, if you want to think about it that way. And it's going to increase GDP and national income by more than $1, because an increase in I, as well as an increase in, let's say, government spending, if you want to look, we haven't talked about government spending yet, but both of them is going to lead to an increase in C. Why? Because income is going up, and income causes a change in consumer spending. So when I changes, aggregate demand or real GDP changes because both I and consumer spending change. Now if government spending goes up, similarly, government spending will go up and consumer spending will go up. So this is known as the multiplier effect. So a $1 increase in investment will lead to a more than $1 increase in national income or real GDP. We could also say a $1 increase in government spending will lead to a more than $1 increase in national income or real GDP. Now, this same multiplier exists. I've already talked about government spending, but also when we talk about net exports, and it exists when consumer spending goes up, as long as the result is a non-income change in consumer spending. Okay? Then we have a multiplier effect with C going up. So if C goes up simply because we have greater consumer confidence, then there's a multiplier effect. So what's the formula? Remember, this could also be represented as the change in GDP. We'd have the change in income over that change in initial level of spending. So if initial level of spending was simply, let's just make up some numbers. Let's say investment went up by $5 billion and national income and GDP goes up by $15 billion, then our multiplier is 3, where that difference between 15 and 5, that $10 billion, is because consumer spending changed by that $10 billion. Whoops, we need a B here for billion. So this last formula here is the same as that one. This one is exactly the same as that one. Depends on what spending variable you're talking about. But we could also write it as 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, which equals 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save. So essentially, where does the multiplier come from? It comes from the fact that when our income changes, we don't necessarily spend all of it, or we might spend a great portion of it. And that's so when we are continuously spending because our income has gone up, we're spending what proportion more of our income change we're now spending, that's going to lead to this multiplier effect. Go into the next page. So here we have an example. Calculate the multiplier if the change in GDP is $4.8 trillion, resulting from a change in investment of $2 trillion. What is the change in consumer spending? All right, so let's calculate the multiplier. Multiplier equals, our change is 4.8 trillion, resulting from a $2 trillion change, $2 trillion change. And our multiplier then is going to be 2.4. And the change in GDP is made up of that change in investment plus a change in consumer spending. We know this is 4.8. We knew this was 2. So this term must be 2.8. And these are trillion dollars. Let's go into the next page. What causes government spending to change that also has a multiplier? Simply changes in how much the government buys as well as sells. So let's say government spending increases by $10 billion. The spending multiplier is 4. So we'll take our 4, that's our multiplier, equals, we want to find out by how much, this is our unknown up here, GDP will change, and we'll put our $10 billion in the denominator, and we'll solve for x, and that's going to be $40 billion. And so that change in GDP of 40 billion is simply going to be made up of 10 billion from government spending plus 30 billion now from consumer spending. So when the government spends money, that's going to cause consumer spending to change because simply our income levels went up. Actually, let me fix this. Let me get my eraser. This is what I meant to do. This causes that. Okay, lastly, what causes net exports to change? Changes in exchange rates. A depreciating weak dollar implies that U.S. exports are cheaper to foreigners, so our exports are going to go up. And appreciating or strong dollar indicates that U.S. can buy imports cheaper. So we'll buy more goods from other countries. So if exports are going up, net exports will go up, aggregate demand will shift to the right. If imports are going up, that means net exports are going down and aggregate demand will shift to the left. And then economic conditions in other countries. How are their economies doing abroad? If their economies are doing well, then they'll buy more of our exports and aggregate demand in our country will go up. So we could see changes in aggregate demand when net exports go up, coming from X increasing or imports going down, X for exports, or the opposite, when exports fall, from exports going down or imports going up.